when you go into nature, Paul and I were talking about is I was like, Paul, some of my best friends are trees. So when I go into a forest, am I just getting serotonin or am I getting other pro-social chemicals? And he said, no, I also think you're getting oxytocin. And that explains something that shows up with nature relatedness. So nature relatedness, and this is well known, when you have this trait or when it's induced via altered states of consciousness, flow, psychedelic states or whatever, it almost immediately starts producing environmental activism. There's a behavior, it's not just a perceptive change, there's a behavioral change on the back end. And Paul has pointed out, his lab has done a lot of work. He was the one, his lab first discovered that oxytocin produces trust and underpins human cooperation. He has since figured out that when you have more oxytocin in your system, it doesn't just increase empathy and trust, it also directly increases charity and activism.
And tribalism.
So,
all spectrums of belonging get increased, right? You don't get to pick what the oxytocin impacts. It's in your system and it impacts all the ways in which, right? Yeah.
Yes. But you draw your tribal, the interesting thing about this, so most people don't realize this, but at a really foundational level, right? Whenever a life form, humans, plants, animal, whatever, meets another life form, it asks a really simple yes or no question. Is this thing like me or not like me? Yes or no, us or them. If it's like me, maybe I can mate with it, or maybe I can befriend it. If it's not like me, maybe I should run away so it doesn't eat me, or maybe I should eat it, right? Like me or not like me and this border initially, like our family is like us, our tribe is like us, but those people who live in that other city over there, they're not exactly like us, right? Like we draw these like us, not like us board, and it happens automatically. Oxytocin helps draw that line, right? It's if in our system we're hanging out with dogs and plants and we notice it, suddenly the line gets extended that far out. But so good and bad. And what's interesting about this is, so oxytocin does not show up in flow. It shows up in group flow, but it is only produced in group experiences. But when we have flow experiences in the natural world, if we have nature relatedness, we may also be getting oxytocin.
That's amazing.
And that's really weird.
That shows the interconnectedness at a neurobiologic level, and that's pretty remarkable.
Stephen, in the same way that oxytocin plays a role in both bonding, but also tribalism and in-group, out-group dynamics, do you think a negative role oxytocin can play when it comes to environmental destruction or potentially an in-group dynamic that justifies
such a good question?
Kind of destroying or damaging the environment.
Yeah, so I'm to stay out of trouble.
What say you?
Well, so when everything got really crazy, in my opinion, it was crazy before, but James Watt, who I've met actually, and is a nice man, even though he's the devil.
I think you just got yourself in trouble.
Secretary of I told him he was the devil. I've said this to his face. But when he was Secretary of Interior under Reagan, he created something called the Wise Use Movement. And it was up to that point, conservatives in America had been very big on environmentalism and conservation and all those things. From the Wise Use Movement basically said, no, this is private property. You should have the right to do whatever you want on your private property, and undercut a lot. It wasn't wise use. It undercut a lot of major environmental laws. And how I got introduced to all this is Mad Magazine used to, on their back page, they used to do those fold it things where you'd fold it up and there'd be a puzzle or something. And for the first time ever, they didn't put that puzzle there. They put a picture of James Watt. They listed everything he did. And they said, we at Mad don't think it's funny. And it was like the first piece of environmental problem. I was 10 or 11, but it was like it cemented something in me because I read what he did.
Crystallizing experience.
This is just wrong and hypocritical, and a bunch of words I probably didn't know when I was 12, but
That was the feeling. That was your early. That was Stephen Kotler, the early days of outrage.
Exactly.
the budding outrage. But I do think, Rian, I really love that question, and I kind of want to weigh in on it too, because I think if you think about it this way, that essentially it's like morally and ethically neutral. So it really will go, if you have like the dark triad in you and you're a high empath or even a moderate empath, we think there's roughly sort of 10 to 13%.
Sarah, most people aren't going to know what the dark triad is. So why don't you start there?
So the dark triad it's narcissistic. Now I'm going to forget the exact three things. What is it? It's oh my God.
I've got it. It's narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy.
It's it's
narcissism. Jonathan, my friends tell me I look like Alfred E. Newman.
Narcissism, it's sociopathy, and it's something else. But but when you have, I think what I would say is that your neurochemistry meets sort of, if you're an adult, this very complex and only partially understood thing we call sort of morality and a conscience and all of our attachment patterns. So if that oxytocin meets up with, somebody who's got radical beliefs that involve you do harm to people if they don't believe, because empathy is a really complex thing. It is not something you wake up one day and you age into it. It's got complexity and nuance how we become these pro-social empathic creatures. Much is inborn. We see it young. We see it very early. There's the emotional empathy and the mirror neurons, but much develops over the first sort of 7 to 10 years of life. And so I think that, as we've seen in cults and other sort of very radical expressions of extreme in-group bonding, I do think that oxytocin can be used as a weapon. I think pretty much anything inside the human spectrum can be. I think there's no shortage of evidence that we're pretty good at that. We can use things for either, incredible change and beauty or like really horrific destruction. So I do think it's something to think about, like how your empathy aligns you with people. Because once you're aligned with a certain ally, it necessitates another that isn't you guys. It's searching for that, in fact.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.